Alright, so we're going to recap Book 2 of the Ethics and move on to Book 3. We spend most of our time in Book 2 simply because Book 3, the first half of Book 3 is substantive, whereas the latter half of Book 3 is very much example-based. That pretty much that structure follows for Book 4 as well, where it's Aristotle using examples to articulate some key points. So, the primary concept we need to understand is that of what Aristotle calls the doctrine of the mean, or what we call the doctrine of the mean. This is how it's commonly referred to in the secondary literature. But Aristotle does not use these exact words. But in order to understand that, remember, we're still focused on this question: what does it mean to live well? And Aristotle is going to identify definitely two, ostensibly three, necessary and jointly sufficient conditions that answer the question of what it means to live well. The first one is moral virtue. The second one is intellectual virtue. And the last is moral luck. Focusing on moral and intellectual virtue, no one disagrees about the necessity of these two criteria for what Aristotle is ultimately after of eudaimonia, or as we translate, happiness or flourishing. Everyone agrees that moral and intellectual virtue play necessary roles in the achievement of eudaimonia. Where people disagree in the scholarly literature is on the role that moral luck plays. What do we mean by moral luck? Moral luck is simply this concept that no matter what you do, you have no control over external circumstances. That is to say, life can throw you such a curveball that things just go bad. And you're not to blame for this. It's of no fault of your own. So the example that Aristotle uses to talk about moral luck is that of King Priam. So if you're unfamiliar, King Priam is the Trojan king at the time of the Trojan War. We meet him in Homer's Iliad. And Aristotle attributes to King Priam all moral and intellectual virtue. So Priam, by all arguments, is eudaimon. He is experiencing eudaimonia. His life is going well, living well, faring well. If you don't know the backstory, the Greeks wage a 10-year-long war on Troy, which ultimately ends in Troy's destruction. And the last couple of months of the war is what the focus of Homer's Iliad is about. And Aristotle asks this question. So let's back up, some more historical context. At the end of the Trojan War, King Priam, he loses his sons, including his most beloved son, Hector. He loses his city. His city is razed to the ground. He loses his wealth. He kind of loses all of his material goods. And the question that Aristotle would have us ask here is, can Priam retain his blessedness? The word that Aristotle uses instead of eudaimonia, but I take it they're related terms, is makarios, blessed. Aristotle asks us, can Priam retain his eudaimonia or his makarios, his blessedness, even in the face of what is complete and abject tragedy? And it's not clear. Aristotle doesn't give us a very clear answer. He really doesn't give us any answer. But it doesn't seem good from Priam. Another classical example of the issue of moral luck is that of Philoctetes. Philoctetes, this relates to the Trojan War, is a Greek hero, and they are sailing from Hellas to Troy. Troy is in modern-day Turkey, and along the way, Philoctetes gets bitten by a snake, and his foot starts to go kind of sour, kind of starts gangrene and all that stuff. And he complains so much that the Greeks, when they're stopped at an island, they just ditch him. They completely leave Philoctetes behind. And they only go to get him when they realize that his archery skills are necessary for the successful siege of Troy. And the question we ask ourselves is, look, Philoctetes being a hero, he instantiates the moral and intellectual virtues. However, can he live and fare well when life has thrown him this kind of curveball? And it's not really clear. Aristotle, like I said, just doesn't give us a very firm answer. What I will say about the issue of moral luck is Aristotle is very clear that good parents are not necessary, but they're vital for living well. He thinks it is the role of parents to instill moral virtues in children. Aristotle views parenthood or parenting as a move from hegemony to autonomy. This is being governed by someone else, namely a child is governed by her parents, to a state where the child is now self-governing. And Aristotle views this as the role of parents. Now, that being said, even though Aristotle thinks that without good parents, it's going to be really hard to be eudaimon in life, Aristotle never gives us a clear-cut answer on the role that moral luck plays. Personally, I think that moral luck is a necessary condition in eudaimonia. I think that without moral luck, or I think that Aristotle thinks, no one cares what I think that Aristotle thinks that moral luck is necessary for the achievement of eudaimonia, but do note that is a point of scholarly debate. As far as moral virtues go and intellectual virtues, no one disagrees about this. And the reason no one disagrees about this is because if you recall when we talked about de anima, Aristotle says that the distinctive human capacities are rational self-governance, and understanding. And these two very specific capacities that are necessary and jointly sufficient for an organism qualifying as a human being directly correlate to moral and intellectual virtue, with rational self-governance being about moral virtue and understanding being about intellectual virtue. So much so that when we get to book 6 next week of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle is going to identify understanding, or dianoia, as a particular intellectual virtue. That'll be for next week. But as far as rational self-governance goes, this is the realm of the moral virtues. Moral virtues are supposed to govern our character. They're supposed to govern our dispositions, the way that we behave in the face of stimuli. And the way that Aristotle understands how moral virtues are supposed to function is with this doctrine of the mean. So that is to say, everything that is potentially a moral virtue is subject to the doctrine of the mean. If we cannot analyze a potential virtue along the doctrine of the mean, then we probably don't have a moral virtue on our hand. So if you recall, a virtue, or the Greek word that Aristotle uses, zarete, is a character state that is the mean between two vices of excess and one of deficiency. Relative to the individual as the phronimos would choose it. And the reason I use this phrase here, the phronimos, is because in Book 6, Aristotle is going to identify the phronimos as the embodiment of the person who is eudaimon. The phronimos is the person who is living and faring well. And so much so that in Book 6, Aristotle is going to identify phronesis, or what commonly is translated as practical wisdom, as one of the 6 intellectual virtues. The phronimos, quite literally, etymologically, is the person who has phronesis. It is the person of practical wisdom. This concept of phronesis that we'll get to next week plays a central role in Aristotelian eudaimonia. Because in Aristotle's mind, you cannot live well or fare well, you cannot be eudaimon, if you do not know how to navigate the world well. What it is to live well and to fare well is to come upon states of affairs, be able to pick out the morally salient issues with morally salient details and behave in a virtuous fashion. And that is what the phronimos is specifically able to do. Now, if we look at the doctrine of the mean, we have this idea that every virtue exists along a continuum, with vice being at both ends. On the one hand, we have a vice of deficiency, and on the other hand, we have a vice of excess. And somewhere in the middle is the virtue. Now, we gotta be careful here. I put this line that's the virtue fairly much so in the actual middle. But Aristotle's clear that the mean here that is the virtue is not an arithmetic mean, but rather it is the mean relative to a person. So we may better understand this empty space between the two vices as being the realm where virtue exists. To understand what Aristotle means when he says that that virtue is not the arithmetical mean, he gives us this example of Milo. Milo is a wrestler. And he says that Milo requires 10 pounds of food a day. And let's imagine at the other end of the spectrum, we have death, where if you consume 0 pounds of food a day, you will die. We cannot then draw from that conclusion that I need to eat 5 pounds of food a day. 5 pounds would be the arithmetical mean between 10 and 0, but we're approaching the situation wrong. Just because 0 foods a day is what causes me to die, and Milo has 10 pounds, doesn't then mean that I need 5 pounds. One's caloric needs are relative to the individual. The pro football player requires more calories than the IT tech. Why? Because the pro football player is simply doing more with their body. They're expending more calories, they have a job in which they need to maintain a certain muscular composition, etc., etc. And as such, they just have greater caloric needs. This is why when you go to the doctor, or when you go someplace and order food, you always see that sign that says 2,000 calories are used as like a generic whatever, as a generic marker for how much people should eat in a day. But the doctor will be the first one to tell you that your dietitian or your dietitians would be the one who better understand how many calories in a day you need. 2,000 is a general marker for what works for human beings, but it doesn't work for everyone. So the same concept applies for virtue. What is virtuous for agent A is not necessarily virtuous for agent B. That being said, virtues are not subjective in the sense that I get to choose what is good for me and you get to choose what is good for you. Virtues are at the biological level. Aristotle thinks that as human beings, we all are fairly similar creatures. And as such, what is good or what is conducive toward my living well and faring well, what is conducive toward my eudaimonia, is going to be the same exact thing that is conducive toward your eudaimonia. Why? Because these are the things, the virtues, the aritai, are that which makes the species life go well, regardless of what particular member of the species this is. So let's look at a couple examples. Let's look at temperance. So the deficiency of, so temperance is the physical management of pleasure, or the management of physical pleasure, and there's different ways that temperance can instantiate itself. Temperance with regard to food, temperance with regard to drink, temperance with regard to sex, temperance with regard to the pursuit of money, etc., etc., etc. There's all these different ways that temperance can manifest itself because it's just managing physical pleasure. So let's focus on food, our nice PG example. So we may say that the vice of deficiency when it comes to temperance is something like undereating or habitual undereating. This is how we can make sense of conditions like anorexia on Aristotle's account. And the vice of excess, which is fairly simple to understand, is that of gluttony. And somewhere in the middle, we have the virtue that is temperance. Temperance is eating the proper amount and of the appropriate kinds of food. Now note, Aristotle can still make sense of things like dieting or things like trying to eat more to gain weight, and those not being vices. So when someone diets to lose weight, they're not under-eating in the sense of this vice. What they're doing is they recognize that they need to lose some weight in order to preserve the physical health of their body. And as such, they are choosing, and we'll get into this later when we discuss the role of choice in virtue, they are choosing to undereat. They're not doing so because they are straying from the virtue, rather they're doing it in an attempt to be virtuous. Or someone who is drastically underweight may choose to overeat and as such put on weight. They're doing this not because they are being gluttonous. They're doing this because they recognize that the proper health of their body requires that they put on some weight. Okay. One more example, because Aristotle is clear that not all of these vices are going to have very clean-cut names. Nevertheless, we can still understand them conceptually. So example here would be something like generosity. Aristotle thinks that generosity is a virtue. Aristotle distinguishes between kind of everyday generosity and what we may think of as excessive magnanimity. And part of this is cultural. In the Hellenic world, those who have exorbitant amounts of wealth, they don't hoard it, they don't spend it trying to send people to outer space or to explore the depths of the ocean or whatever our ultra wealthy do now. They don't spend it on private jets. What they do with their wealth is public works. They build libraries, they build statues, they fund wars, they build temples to the gods. This is what, if you have exorbitant wealth, this is what is expected of you socially. That you simply use your wealth toward the polis, toward the public good. And so let's look at just plain Jane generosity. Our virtue is precisely that, it is generosity. It is possible to undergive. That would be something like stinginess. Think of like Ebenezer Scrooge. This is the complaint against Ebenezer, is that he has enough wealth that he can afford to be generous, but nevertheless he's stingy. The vice, and this is something we don't really have an easy time conceptualizing in Judeo-Christian culture, is that We think that generosity is this never-ending flow of let's just keep giving if we can, and it's good to always give. But not in Aristotle's mind, not in the Hellenic mind. In the Hellenic mind, there is this upper limit to generosity, and it's somewhat intuitive. We can imagine a case where someone gives so much of their resources that they then endanger the financial and physical well-being of both themselves and or their family. So giving so much that now you can't feed your kids, or giving so much that you now can't make your mortgage payment. This is what Aristotle, in Aristotle's mind, this is the vice of excess when it comes to generosity. And it's something that we don't have a word for. And Aristotle's okay with that. We don't need a word for everything. We understand the concept. So we may just call it something like overgiving. And somewhere in the middle, between stinginess and overgiving, lies our virtue of generosity. Generosity is knowing how much to give, when to give, why we are giving, to whom we ought to give, and how much to give. Okay. Now, let's look a little bit about virtues in the abstract. Aristotle thinks that all virtues are subject to choice. And to flesh this out in greater detail, Aristotle differentiates between the means and the end. Okay. The end is, or the word that he uses here is the telos. The end is our goal. It's what our pursuit is aimed at. We do not deliberate, we do not choose the end. Rather, what we deliberate about is how to achieve the end. And to understand this, he gives us examples from trades. So imagine that we are, your dog trainers or whatever. Our job is to train police dogs. It's very clear what our goal is. Our goal is to take this German Shepherd or Belgian Malinois, whatever it may be, and to turn it into a police dog, to turn it into a dog that will obey specific commands and behave in certain ways. That's the end. No one deliberates about what the goal or the purpose of a police dog trainer is. The same way no one questions what the goal of a baker is. The purpose of being a baker, the telos or end of a baker, is to bake things. What we do question is the means by which to best get there. So an expert dog trainer may know that certain breeds require certain methods, or she may know that certain temperaments of dogs are best dealt with in certain manners. What she deliberates about is how to best bring about her end. How does she go about best creating a service-worthy dog? And the same goes for the virtues, Aristotle thinks. So we got virtue. Let's consider our virtue of courage. The goal of courage is proper management of fear. Aristotle does not think that being courageous is simply not experiencing fear. Rather, being courageous is knowing when to be afraid, what to be afraid of, how to be afraid of that thing, and what to do in the face of fear. So the goal of courage is the proper management of fear. And then we have to ask ourselves, how do we get here? How do we achieve this goal of proper management of fear? And this is where Aristotle thinks it looks different from person to person. So imagine an example. Imagine two friends are heading home. One is a physically capable firefighter. The other one is an overweight IT tech. They're heading home and they see that there is a burning building, and they hear cries for help from the burning building, and they're deliberating now upon what they ought to do. Both the overweight IT tech and the physically capable firefighter, they desire to be courageous. They have virtuous desires. They know that what courage demands of them is proper management of fear, but they're asking themselves, like, how do I do this thing? How do I get there? And Aristotle here is going to think that, well, it just varies between these two people. They can't both do the same thing. There's no cookie-cutter answer that's going to make them both brave. So, for example, the brave thing to do for the overweight IT tech may simply be to call emergency services. By contrast, the brave thing to do for the firefighter may be, I don't know, it depends on the state of affairs, it may be for her to run into the burning building and save the person at hand. Maybe the fire isn't very big yet, there's very little smoke, and she knows that she can safely reach this person because of her training. So even though they can both be courageous and they can both instantiate bravery, the way in which they do so is going to look radically different. Okay? And the reason for those differences is due to the differences between these two agents. The overweight IT tech lacks both the skill and the physical capabilities in order to successfully save this person, but the in-shape firefighter possesses these skills. So bravery exists along a spectrum. We have cowardice as our vice of deficiency, courage or bravery as our virtue, and brashness as our vice of excess. It would be brash, Aristotle would think, for the overweight IT tech to run into the building. Why? Because she lacks the skills that are necessary. She lacks both the specific capabilities and the physical adeptness to be successful in this. So for her to do the same courageous action as the firefighter would be an act of brashness. It would demonstrate that she does not know how to properly manage her fear because she doesn't understand or fully appreciate the severity of the situation at hand. It shows that she does not understand, one, her lack of skill with regard to the dangers that are present and how to behave when there are dangers present. By contrast, if the in-shape firefighter simply calls emergency services, says, hey, I'm on clock, I don't feel like dealing with it, let Jimmy, who's on the clock, deal with this, Aristotle may think that that's an act of cowardice. Why? Even though she does the same exact action as the overweight IT tech, she knows that she can do more. She possesses both the physical adeptness and the cognitive know-how to be successful in saving this person from the fire. So as such, her lack of running into the fire, even though it is courage for the overweight IT tech, is cowardice for her. And we could extrapolate this example to things like temperance. So temperance being the management of physical pleasure, focus on food again. Both the, let's say, the overweight individual and the anorexic can desire to be virtuous, they can desire to instantiate temperance, but what that looks like is going to be very, very different. What it looks like perhaps for the overweight individual to instantiate temperance is to eat less, restrict their calories, deny themselves good foods, and maybe just enjoy or try to enjoy bland, low-calorie meals. By contrast, the anorexic person recognizes they need to put on weight, they want to be healthy, and in order for them to be temperate, Maybe they definitely need to eat more, so they need to have an excess of calories. But in addition to that, perhaps they need to indulge in some more savory foods. It's really hard to gain weight on vegetables, chicken, and rice. Can you do it? Sure. But that's a lot of vegetables, chicken, and rice to eat. So whereas the glutton, in an attempt to be temperate, may need to skip the Taco Bell, maybe the anorexic who is attempting to bring her body back into a state of health, maybe she gets to enjoy the Taco Bell. She gets to enjoy these fattier meals because it helps put weight on. Okay. So Aristotle is not going to think that there is a cookie cutter answer for how we ought to behave. There's no do this. Rather, all Aristotle can say is be courageous, be temperate, be magnanimous. But if we then ask Aristotle, well, how do I be courageous? What does courage look like for me? Aristotle's going to say, well, we need to figure out what situation you're in, and we need to figure out the details about you. I can't just say, do X, and guarantee that you're going to instantiate courage. There's so much more involved here. Aristotle very much has a very personal account of what courage is going to look like, or any virtue is going to look like, from individual to individual. Next time we'll discuss more the role of choice in the virtues, as well as run through some more examples. The week afterward, we'll start our discussion on the intellectual virtues. But we'll pause there.